Hello, everybody.
Yes. Hello.
Per usual, we'll give a couple minutes for stragglers, but get started pretty promptly at just after 2. Thank you, Kent, for chiming in. Everybody knows the protocol for attendance. Put your name, where you're from, and then we will ask for more chat from you at the end for your CEU information. Really important that we get that so that we can confirm your attendance for the continuing education credits. So don't give us the CEU stuff now. We'll ask for that towards the end.
Okay, palm tree.
Lance, are you testing ISA or NAA? Or are you testing?
I'd like to test for ISA.
Have you started your application yet?
I have not.
You should get that started.
Okay.
We can send you some information, okay?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I have everybody on my list. I just haven't organized it yet because some of you I've reached out to and some I haven't. And Graham, I think, has reached out a couple, but we'll figure it out.
Okay.
Somebody can fact check this for me. I did a little searching and it looks like these do exist, but I don't know about all the factoids being correct. There are snails that live around hydrothermal vents. Thought this was kind of a neat little factoid. Obviously nothing to do with trees directly. But just really cool looking, and they can survive really extreme temperatures. So yeah, just kind of a fun little thing to share with everybody while we're waiting to get started.
Yeah, 750 degrees. I'd take maybe 70 of that today if we could get it.
Yeah, and that'd still get us to maybe 60 or so.
Yeah. Yeah, darn it. Shells are made of iron. Man.
That's the part I'm not sure
Wow.
about. Anyway.
Well, if it's from General Jambalaya, it must be good. So.
Oh yeah, that's solid information.
That is cool though, to think how life finds a way.
Yeah.
Graham, can I interject real quick just about that question and then
Yeah.
the resources? So we would like you to please in the chat tell us, how are you getting the link? Are you getting it from Eventbrite or are you getting it from Graham or I? Because we would like to know going forward what method is working. Because obviously you're all here because you got the link. So how did you get the link? Did you get it in both, one or the other?
And maybe other than today, because today was an exception as far as me sending out the link. Chrissy was in scramble mode to protect her bees. Temperatures are dipping way down in the panhandle.
Yeah.
And so she had to go run an errand, and so I sent out the link today. So yeah, we're not sure whether the emails to all of you from Eventbrite are making it to you. Okay, yeah. I'm
Thank
guessing,
you guys so much.
Yeah. I bet the spam filter is capturing those from Eventbrite would be my guess. So
Right.
it's
What
whether
we've
we're
learned
sending
with
those direct-
Eventbrite is that typically three things happen. Either your virus wall will bounce it and will not even let it in. It'll go to your junk mail, or you'll actually get it. And so sometimes where we just don't know, we're trying to do the backup of sending it from us. But there's sometimes that when we get so many people, so many receivers on our email list, it'll bounce them back to us. Okay, the other thing too, just a quick update. I know that we've been talking about this a lot lately. We do have it ready, and this is a part of the whole email thing. So we did get the resources uploaded to our website, so that way you guys can access them. I will be sharing this link in an email here by the end of today. So we are going to progressively continue to add the PDFs of the presentations and a recording of what the past session. So if you want to review one, you can do that. Otherwise, our plan is to leave this, the videos will be available until March 31st. And so this series ends on March 11th, and you will have a couple weeks after that. And then the links will no longer be active after March 31st. So you have that time to watch them as many times as you want to. And then also look at any of the presentations. So if you guys have any questions about that later on, let me know, but you should be getting that in your email.
Content-wise, we may or may not be wrapping things a little quicker than 90 minutes. And if that is the case, then we'll take the remainder of the time to take some review questions over all the material and chapters that we've covered so far. So we'll kind of play that by ear and see how things go with Justin and I and the chapters that we're covering. And if we do have a good chunk of time, rather than wrapping early, we'll open the floor to miscellaneous questions over all the chapters we've gone over so far. I guess one other thing to mention is if you have, Chrissy and I are figuring out how to fine tune this process, make it simple for everybody. There were some last minute changes that we made based on all the demand that complicated things. And so that'll sort itself out next go around. But if there are certain observations you have on, hey, this was kind of wonky, or it'd be simpler if it worked this way, those kind of things are good for Chrissy or I to get an email from you about when you got a couple minutes. So, yeah, Eventbrite, it's complicated, but we need to keep it simple on your end as much as possible. So we're always looking for feedback there. We're aware of a number of changes we want to make, but there might be other things we haven't thought of or realized are going on that you guys can bring to our attention. So at 8 after, you want to kick it off, Justin? We'll need your, oh, there you go.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready when you're ready.
Cool, let's just get rolling.
All right, good people. I'll share this screen. Everybody can see that, I hope, and I want to call up my chat here, so make sure I can see any questions that come along. Although, Chrissy, you'll probably monitor chat.
Yeah.
I will, yeah.
Graham,
And Graham,
yes.
yep.
Thank you, guys. All right.
Yep.
Well, happy afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Justin Evertson with the Nebraska Forest Service, and I'm happy to be back again today to talk about tree planting. That's one of my favorite, endeavors. I try to plant trees about every day I can. If I'm not eating donuts, I like to be planting trees. We're not planting many trees right now, but in the heart of winter, we normally rest a little bit. And boy, my back has been horrible these last few weeks, so I'm happy to have some winter rest here. Let me say this right up front. I hope everybody can see the screen. Please ask, as Graham said, we probably won't go 90 minutes today. I don't think I have that much content. Planting trees isn't rocket science or brain surgery, right? So we can probably get through it pretty quickly, but please ask questions and don't be afraid to challenge anything I say. We do have to tie it into the study manual, but when we talk tree planting and landscape related stuff, very little of it's black and white, right? There's a lot of gray area. And I like to hear other people's opinions and methods if they contrast a little bit from mine. I'm not the only one that knows how to plant a tree, and what works for me may not work for somebody else. This is a big state too, so sometimes things are different from east to west. So boy, shout it out or type in a question and say, Justin, that doesn't sound right, or can you go back and touch on that a little more? So, and I'll just real quickly, I try to do this about every time. You're probably bored of it, but when I give a program, I always say, why the heck do we bother getting certified in arboricultural care, or why do we plant trees, or why do we care about any of this? Because trees are just so darn important. Even here in a prairie state, have any of you been out to Girdling? If you walk west from downtown there, you'll end up in that neighborhood just west of downtown, and that's one of the best little community areas in western Nebraska to feel the value of trees. Those are all mostly hackberry, so let's hope we don't have a hackberry disease come through, but man, you can see the value of trees out there. Even one well-placed tree provides lots and lots of benefits to a home and all the world around us. Trees just make life better. And who doesn't, you know, really what we're trying to do here, right, is plant trees that get big and old, we hope, even in our communities. So who doesn't like big old trees? State champion trees like this chinkapin oak south of Nebraska City, this grove of ginkgos at Arbor Lodge, dating back to the days of the Morton family. There's my son when he was small at a 400-year-old bur oak at Ponca State Park. So look at this bur oak out in central Illinois that Guy Sternberg showed us. This thing's potentially closer to 1,000 years old. They know it's at least 500 years old, and it's huge. So trees mark our communities, and really what it's about, they make our communities livable. Who'd want to live on the Great Plains without trees? I always think about in Nebraska, you know you're coming up to a town when you see either the trees or the grain elevator. And that's a Nebraska community iconically, isn't it? That to me gives me comfort to know, oh, hey, there's a town over there. I'm going over there to get a brew or a donut. Now, we don't get good community trees by accident. It starts with good selection, siting, planting, and establishment. And if we don't get those things right, maybe we keep arborists employed because they're trying to correct all our problems, but none of it else matters if we don't get those things right. And we often shortchange those basic aspects of getting our trees off to a good start. And it all really starts with good nursery stock. You know, really, this is what we need to do. If you can't plant the acorn or the seed, you're probably going to a nursery to get planting stock. That's how it works. If we look in the ISA book, they'll talk about 4 types of nursery stock: bare root, balled and burlapped, containerized, and container grown. But I think they left one out, and I put those as spade dug trees. We have a lot of spade operators in the state moving good sized trees around, and the good ones really do good work and give us good trees. So there's another option. Just be aware that an emerging trend over the last several years, thank goodness, has been grow bags and other root production method containers. They've really changed the science of our containers, so we're getting better trees, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, let me just say this. I shop at Walmart too. I shop at Home Depot. They have good products. But go to your good local Nebraska nurseries whenever you can to get our trees. Yeah, they may cost a little more, but you really know what you're getting when you're working with our good nurseries. The thing that catch me from big box stores when you buy those plants, they've been trucked in here from who knows where. They may not be acclimated, and they may not be species we want to grow in Nebraska. And then that kid selling you the underwear the day before is selling you that tree that day. So is that the tree you want? Now, I don't want to dump on big box stores, but really, our good Nebraska nurseries, we have some of the best paying attention to tree quality and root production methods and all that stuff. So support them. An ideal root system is laterally spreading and fibrous. This is what we're trying to really get right when we're buying and transplanting nursery trees. This is what it's really comes down to, and it's the hardest thing to do, to get those roots right, because getting the roots as big and fibrous as we want them to be makes it really difficult to handle and transport nursery trees. So we end up with nursery methods which maybe change some of the root production over time, and we'll look at that a little bit. So this would be ideal. If you could get nursery trees like this all the time, can you see my arrow there? That would be ideal. Now that's almost impossible to do all the time. So we have other methods to get us nursery trees. But here's what we're trying to get to, right? After a tree starts growing, we want this good visible trunk flare with wide spreading and good variety of anchor tree roots that are radiating out from the base of the tree. If we're not doing that, if we're not seeing this, we're doing our nursery production and planting wrong. And we have been getting it wrong in large measure the last few decades. We're doing better now, but there was a time when we really screwed this up a lot. So here are just quickly those methods that you get for trees. Bare root trees. This used to be really the way they did nursery production. I see I have a misspelling in there. Timing, keeping roots moist, and breaking ormancy. Does anybody know what ormancy is? That's supposed to be dormancy. So bare root trees, you know, even when I was a kid, they were real common. We got away from them because there are problems related to the timing. You can only plant them in early spring. You got to put a lot of effort into keeping the roots moist. And then it's difficult to get some species to break their dormancy as they've been put in cold storage. So a lot of people went away from bare root. Another prominent method for a long time was balled and burlapped. It still is. Less so now that we have containerized trees, but this is still a pretty good method to get trees. It is far from perfect. It has its own set of issues, including the weight of a tree is just heavy. You probably can't do it alone. Roots can be a problem because you can't see the roots back inside that tree. Root depth is often an issue. There are twine and burlap issues. The wire basket and balled and burlap trees generally cost more. So the industry really shifted a few decades ago to container grown trees or containerized trees. There's a difference. What the ISA study manual wants you to know is that container grown trees are trees that are started at an early age and grown up in a container all steps of the way, whereas a containerized tree could be any tree harvested in some method or grown in some method and then just put temporarily in a container to be transported and sold. So there are minor differences there, but generally we're talking about container grown trees. And they have their set of issues, including circling and matted roots, stem girdling roots, and they're often too deep in the container. We'll touch on this in a minute about some of the issues. So here's just some of the problems we're talking about with the container plant here on the upper left. The soil ball, the soil above the root system was packed in above on that container. So if you had planted this tree at the depth that we used to think we should, it would have been 8 inches too deep in the soil. Look at these circling and girdling roots. Trunk girdling roots or stem girdling roots are common from containerized trees. And we planted a lot of junk for a lot of years, not realizing how important the root systems were. Let's say this though, right up front. Not all containerized trees are bad. Nurseries are figuring out how to do this, and even with traditional container trees, you can get good stock. So that's why I say work with your good reputable nursery that's willing to take a tree back if the root system is compromised. And look at this tree on the right. It came from a container, but it sure looks to me like those roots are not bound up in there too hard that we can't pull them out and get it off to a good start. Or look at this one Eric Berg was working with several years ago. What are you going to do with that tree, man? You can shave the sides of that to give it a good try. But this should have been a tree rejected at the nursery and just say, I'm going to a different nursery, in my opinion. Okay, we're trending now towards containerized trees that happen in grow bags or root production methods. So we got away from some of these traditional containers. Now they have graduated pots with slit holes in the sides. They trap the roots so they don't keep spinning. Or look at these containers on the right. Again, that's a root trapping thing. The root, there's air pruned so it doesn't keep spinning in the container. And then these are fabric bags. Up here on the upper left is a mesh bag where the roots grow through. You peel the bag off and then you transplant the tree. You lose a lot of roots. This is an in-ground system. It shocks the tree quite a bit, but the buds of those roots left behind are ready to regenerate and grow outward. And then there's these fabric bags now that are really popular. These are an above ground system, more or less replacing these old containers with a bag which traps the roots. Let's just say this too right up front. You can get problematic trees in these systems. They're not perfect. You got to remember this is part of a root pruning system. And if the nursery didn't bump them up gradually all the way along, you can get hooked and circling roots even in bag produced trees. So there again, you got to be working with reputable nurseries who are going to stand by their product. What about plant size? Generally speaking, the smaller the tree you plant, probably the better off you'll be in terms of getting faster establishment and quicker growth. That's not always perfectly so though, but just the simple thought that the smaller the tree is, the more of the root system you can bring with it. And then that's why it's less shock, transplant shock, and it starts better. So ideally, we would plant smaller trees with as much of the root system as possible, but you can end up with poor root systems even in small trees. And conversely, if you work with somebody who really is good at doing bare root trees, gravel trees, balled and burlapped or spade dug trees, you can get a lot of that root system even in bigger trees. But just beware that generally smaller trees are better. I've always said if you can plant the acorn, beat the squirrel to it, boy, you're going to have a tree for life. But most people aren't going to do that, are they? Nobody's going to wait for that. So planting bigger trees is the issue. With the issue of this is we're just leaving too many roots behind in the hole. If we're digging them out and transplanting them, it's just hard to move all those roots with it. But it can be done. We can move big trees if we know what we're doing. And if you work with a good tree spade operator, and they'll say, you know, that's a 6-inch tree. I'm not using my 36-inch spade on it. It's just not going to work. So generally, you get about 18 inches of tree spade for every 1-inch caliper of trunk. So you can see if you got a 2-inch caliper tree, the maximum spade you should be using is about 36 inches. Well, that's really hard to size out with a lot of species or trees left in the nursery. But it can be done. We really can move trees well with big spades. Just be aware there are good proper planting BMPs out there. We have one in our office that we did several years ago, tree selection and planting best practices. Send me a note and I'll send you a PDF on that, or get online. And I think the Tree Owner's Manual is now a free document online produced by the U.S. Forest Service in cooperation with other entities. That's a good little guide for all we're talking about here. And of course, the ISA study manual too. Okay, that was just a quick summary of nursery stock. We got to get that right. Then when we have a good nursery product and we're ready to plant it, we got to get these things right. These are the key elements that if we get these right, we're going to be off to a good start. But if we screw up any one of them, we can really screw it up from day one. So avoid planting too deep, avoid and correct root problems at planting time, Plant at the right time of year, stake and protect properly, pick the right tree for the right place, dadgummit, and water properly. And don't just walk away for 5 years and then say, what happened to my tree? You got to give it good follow-up care. And that means monitoring not just water, but the staking, the mulch, trunk guards, and everything else that's going along with that. So we see a lot of people planting and walking away and then going, oh my God, my tree died 5 years later and it was girdled at the base or something from the twine left on. Okay, number 1, in my opinion, avoid planting too deep. The root flare when we transplant any stalk should be visible at the base of the trunk, and the first main lateral roots should be no deeper than about 1 to 2 inches below the soil surface. But they do need to be under the soil surface. A lot of people err the other way and plant too high, and then they can sometimes leave those first lateral roots exposed to the cold winter air. That'll shortchange your tree too. So they do need to be under the soil surface. And maybe your mulch is going to be your soil surface the first year or two. Better to plant too high than too deep. If we do plant too deep, we end up with adventitious roots. The tree tries to find a way and it's putting out roots higher up on the trunk to try and find a way. That's not good. They often end up becoming stem girdling roots and other problematic components to the tree. And then look here on the right. If you have a deciduous tree especially that looks like a telephone pole going into the ground, we've planted it too deep, or we've regraded around the tree and brought the soil up to it. And either way, those are not good things for the long-term care of the tree. Just remember, those first lateral roots, if you can see my arrow here, are just under the soil surface with a little bit of mulch over the top. At planting time, equally important is correct any root problems that you can see and discern as you're planting. So if you have circling, girdling roots, a tree came out of a container and you can see what's going on. Here's Eric trying to salvage this containerized tree. You better fix them at planting time so you don't end up with root issues that shortchange the life of that tree going forward. Correct girdling, circling, or pot-bound roots, or reject any compromised root systems from the nursery before you plant it, because this is what can happen. Stem girdling roots left untaken care of as that tree matures can compromise that tree. This one on the upper right is a little bit of a misnomer in this context, but the container here we might equate to the street was containing that root system. It couldn't branch out like it needed to, and it blew over in a wind event. But look at what will happen to other trees also if their stem girdling roots are not taken care of. I hope that makes sense. It can't be perfect all the time, but we need to try and fix those roots right at planting time. Talking about just some issues we go forward with different planting stock, balled and burlapped issues. These are the things I've seen the most common in my time. Root depth is sometimes an issue because the soil ball is brought up back around the first main lateral roots as it's dug, and then you end up planting it too deep sometimes if you haven't figured that out. I've seen people leave a lot of twine and rope on the basis of balled and burlap trees, especially evergreen trees. It's got to come off. I don't care if it's biodegradable or not. All twine and rope has to come off. What do you do with the burlap in the basket? What do you do with depth? These are issues related to balled and burlap trees. And so just for me, if I'm planting a balled and burlap tree, I get my hole dug to the side where I want it planted. And then I'm laying down this balled and burlap tree. I'm taking all the twine off, and then I'm going to peel that wire basket off. And then I'm going to start taking that burlap off if it's a tree I can handle, not too big. And I'm not worried too much about ball integrity, because if the root system is good within there, it's going to hang together just fine. And then I'll pull that all off and put it into the hole. If it's a great big balled and burlap tree that you can't do that with, it's too hard to handle, you could put it in the hole first, as long as you know the right planting depth, and then peel off that wire basket and that burlap up absolutely as deep as you can get it into the hole. There is some debate over whether we need to take the wire basket off or not. I don't personally think the wire basket, leaving it on, is a big issue. The problem with leaving it on is if you've left it on, you probably haven't figured out the proper depth of the tree. So does that make sense to you? We really got to get the proper depth of the B&B tree figured out right up front when we're planting it. But otherwise, get everything off that you can. This on the lower right was a good example of how they were able to get the tree in the hole, kept the root ball together, and now they're going to peel off or cut, or if this is biodegradable burlap, push it all the way back in the hole and let it degrade deeply into the hole. That's a solution. I try to cut it off and get it out of the way. And then be aware that burlap sometimes is treated and it doesn't break down. So do you want to take a chance on having treated burlap, which is a problem as you go forward? Any thoughts on there with balled and burlap trees? Some of you tree professionals, I see a lot of you are longtime tree planters. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Justin, this is Kent. I guess we'd be a little concerned about pushing the burlap down into the hole.
Yeah.
And you're minimizing, I mean, if you can get it down maybe far enough, but you're still kind of creating a barrier there between the root ball and the rest of the soil. And it seems like that's not necessarily a desirable thing.
Yeah, I agree, Kent. Who the heck said they should do that?
Yeah, you know what I always say is, if you don't want that ball to fall apart and you want to leave the burlap in place as you put it in the hole, as Justin mentioned, measure twice, cut once, get the right proper depth. And then if I don't have the room to get down with a utility knife and cut that burlap off and clip the cage off even, then I haven't dug a wide enough hole, right? So then you're just trying to smush that balled and burlap tree into a hole, and you're being lazy about digging it wide and having some nice loose backfill for the tree to put back into.
Good thoughts, Graham. Yep.
Yeah, I love leaving it in place as I put the tree in its permanent location, but then having that material to take off after it's in situ keeps me honest about digging the hole wide enough to encourage those roots to expand out beyond the ball into the parent soil.
Yep, right on. I like what you said there. I do hear a lot of times people say, well, the nursery required that I kept that ball together, and that may be a fair issue. And so in that case, get the ball in the hole and then cut everything back as far as you can and just get rid of, like Kent was saying, make sure you get all that out of the way of the laterally spreading roots and you should be okay. I'm looking at this tree here, and that's about a 2.5-inch caliper tree. That is not a very big ball. I'd be curious to see what that root system, if I could wash that root system and look at it, what it looks like in there. It may not have maybe 5 or 10% of its root system intact. So just something to think about. This also ties into what we were just talking about. Timing is critical. Try to plant in the spring and fall when the weather is cool, and avoid, I would just say, the heat of the summer. Stop planting if you can by mid-June through August. Now, I know this doesn't work well for nurseries and landscapers. You got to be working all summer long, and we can plant container trees or properly managed trees all summer long. We can do it, but ideally you would just do it in the cooler parts of the year. For me, I do almost all my planting in the late fall, even into December. I love the cooler weather, and one of the big reasons why is I can really examine the roots of any type of tree I'm planting. Bare root, containerized, balled and burlapped, I can wash it off, see what the roots look like, and correct root problems when the weather is cool. The other reason I really like fall planting is that it just really reduces transplant shock and watering needs. It has that whole winter to settle out. Its roots will actually start growing if the weather stays a little warm in the fall and winter, and it'll be ready to rock and roll by the next spring.
Hey,
Now,
Justin.
with evergreens, I generally like to plant all my evergreens very late winter or early spring if I can, just before candle breaks. But those are the two differences for me. Yes, Graham.
Kent and I were talking about this recently. I've had a couple different people throughout the years share an anecdote about sycamore being problematic as a fall planting. And I had never put much stock in that. We did plant 2 sycamore at Douglas County Extension that did die back to the root system that were fall planted. That could be coincidence or not. They've got a nice strong leader now and seem to be sorting that dieback out well. But I'm curious whether anybody else has ever had that experience or heard that from anybody on a particular species like sycamore not being as good for fall planting. If anybody has heard something like that, I'd love to hear about it, because I'm trying to make sense of why that would be so species specific and whether that's even actually a thing.
I was told years ago by a couple nurserymen, don't plant red oaks in the fall. And they had a couple other species, and they might have had sycamore in that too. I can't remember. I remember there was a list. And so I always thought I should avoid planting red oaks in the fall. But here in the last couple decades, I haven't had any issue with that here in Waverly. But I would tell you this, I get a lot of people telling me it doesn't work that well in western Nebraska with their wide open and desiccating winters. And I believe that. So
Is
I
red
don't want
oak
to say fall is better than spring. It works great for me. Spring is still probably the best time for everything generally.
Yeah. Is red oak kind of a bottomland? I know it's not a floodplain species, but I'm
Yeah,
wondering if the context that it grows in is similar to sycamore and that has something to do with it.
I don't.
Sycamore is kind of a floodplain species, so I could see it being a little more water dependent, but
Right.
yeah, I don't
I
know.
don't doubt that there's some species specific issues. I just don't know of them real well.
But I agree with you. I love fall, especially because it's a planting season that we kind of get all to ourselves as tree nerds.
Yeah.
Everybody else is putting in their tomatoes and their bedding plants
Yes.
and stuff in the spring, and when fall comes around, we're the only ones that really get to do any planting.
And for me, I want to reserve my springs for tree care and not tree planting because I have a lot going on trying to keep up with mulching and pruning and everything else. So, and then I tried to touch on evergreens are a little different. You should only plant evergreens early in the spring before candle break or late summer when the weather starts to cool a little bit, but you still get a little bit of time for root growth before the weather shuts down. I do agree with that. Soil amendments or fertilizers, do you put those in the planting hole? Generally, no, but it depends a little bit. Ideally, we would start with really good soil and not have to worry about any of that. But I have some planting sites in Waverly that are just heavy, pure clay, and I amend those planting holes every time I plant one. Not the whole hole, but I plant the trees a little high, and I put good topsoil organic matter around the base of that tree and work it in around the tree. And then I use a lot of mulch. And I think if I did not do that, those trees would really struggle in that heavy clay. It's not ideal, but I do a little bit of that. And then with fertilizer, no. We would generally say, again, unless you thought their soil was so horrible there was a problem, you wouldn't want to fertilize those new trees. And if you're planting in a spot that is that horrible, you really want a tree there, is maybe what I would say. So we need to think about soil well ahead of planting time. If it's a really horrible, horrible site, do you need a tree there? Maybe not. In our park in Waverly, where it's horrible, horrible basement clay, but yet we need to put trees in for shade and wind protection around the ball fields, we just make the best of it. And if I could show you some pictures, it took several years for the site to season out, but those trees are doing great now, even though we more or less amended every hole we did. So it's not ideal, but just remember the best tree growth starts with, and I'm sure Chrissy went over soil with you last week, but start with good soil. Man, that's 90% of the battle if you can put trees in good organic soil. And do any soil correcting before planting if possible, like here where they're adding topsoil to this site. That's when you would want to blend it into the top layer of the soil so you don't have horizons or real weird quick changes in soil textures. They say avoid tilling and compaction as much as possible when you're working around the soil of tree planting sites. And then I would say if you can, plant trees and things with living mulch around them so that soil will stay healthier through the life of that tree. And then finally, time is your friend. If you have patience, it can take a few years, but your site will season out a little bit if you start adding mulch and a little compost over time. And maybe you should just wait 2 or 3 years before you plant that tree to let it season out. Does that make sense a little bit to you? And then watering. Don't forget to water those trees. Jiminy Christmas this last year was horrible, wasn't it? Our trees in Nebraska aren't going to live without a little water, especially at time of transplant. I've been real fortunate where I plant most of my trees in eastern Nebraska that I have watered very little established trees the last 10 years because we haven't had a bad drought, but we're heading into a drought cycle now. Every new tree I plant, I water, and I water regularly the following year or two. I just plan for that. That's why I say I do my planting in the fall so I can keep up with watering the next spring. And like I said, if you plant in the fall, usually the winter helps you reduce the amount of water stress that you'll have on that tree. But general rule of thumb, about 1 inch equivalent of rain per week when trees are young. What does that equate to? 5 to 10 gallons at a time, maybe 2 to 3 times a week. Again, this is not everything written in stone. It depends on the type of tree planted, the type of soil, the weather conditions at the time. You may have to water every other day for a while, or you may not have to water for a month, depending on what happens, or if you have an irrigation system around. So, yeah, Graham.
I'm cringing a little bit at this bottom left picture. Is this kind of a watering during planting, like we're not done backfilling yet?
Yeah, I don't know. I just grabbed it to say I do a lot of watering with a bucket.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, that's probably not a perfect, because the plant's either too deep or something's going on, right?
Yeah, and we do have a question in the chat about filling the hole with water and planting a tree in that. Michael says, I've been in this industry for 18 years, and just this past year was told for the first time ever, this is the way to be planting trees. Seemed to be a questionable practice. So Michael, if you can unmute, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit. We're saying fill the hole with water and plant the tree without any soil in it?
Yeah, basically fill the hole with water, drop the tree in, and then do your backfill and whatnot. And I've never done it that way, and that's how I was told to plant trees last year.
Huh.
I mean, Graham, that's kind of along the lines of like the method that I've commonly used is that when you get your hole dug and you get your tree in and you do your backfill and then you shove the end of a garden hose down into the bottom of the hole that you dug and then fill it up from the bottom up. So that way the gravity of the wet soil naturally settles in between the roots without, because you don't want to stomp around the root ball when you're planting.
Yeah. And that's a good point. And maybe it's really not that different than what we're talking about, other than the order that you do things in order to have that settling occur well and not have big clods and big air spaces there in your backfill. And I agree with you, Chrissy. I'm always leery of really stomping down that backfill excessively. The trees need good gas exchange to promote the roots to grow into that backfill and then out beyond your planting hole. So getting excessive with smushing all that backfill back down, I try to caution people against doing that too much. You just want firm ground for the tree to stay upright in. And yes, I don't know, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I don't see the point of filling up the hole with water ahead of time, although it won't hurt if it drains out. But if you're in a heavy clay soil like we are in Waverly, I wouldn't do that. You're going to have a hard time. It'd be like planting your tree in a bathtub, and you'll have to replace the water with soil somehow. But I can see if you're in porous soil and dry soil, there's nothing wrong with that. When I'm planting, I get the tree kind of 90% of the way, then I put water around it, and I take the shovel the way around it to try and break up any air pockets. Then I put the rest of the soil on and water it again. That's generally how I do it. But that, like I say, that other people, well, there's nothing wrong with filling that hole with water if it's going to percolate out pretty quickly.
I would guess you might end up with an insufficient amount of backfill if
Yeah,
water isn't draining out of your planting hole quick enough. So then you got to return to the tree later and put a little bit more backfill in there because you didn't have the space for it with the water in the hole.
yeah. And
That'd
it
be
looks
my
like
only
that's what they're doing here in that picture. They probably watered it in part of the way through planting, and then they're gonna have to add more soil.
Yeah, interesting.
And then I'll
Thanks,
just,
Michael.
Yep.
yeah, right on. I don't want to also, I do not use the tree bags for watering. I've heard good and bad things about them. Like with anything, it's how well you use it and keep up with it. If you use a watering bag, take it off every fall, or you're going to end up with a nesting spot for critters or trunk damage at some point, and it'll break up over the winter and won't be reusable. So use them like they're supposed to be used. There's nothing wrong with the bag. It trickles the water out slowly overnight or over a day. I figured out for me in Waverly, I might as well just dump 5 gallons of water on that a week and I'm just as far along. But I don't want to say they're a bad thing at all, because they help a lot of people. We also want to mulch our trees generally when we're done planting. I can't think of a reason why you would not want to use some organic mulch around the base of a tree. Mulching helps improve soil organic content, reduces soil temperature extremes, helps reduce weed competition, and helps retain soil moisture. So add about 2 to 4 inches of good wood mulch as wide as possible, at least 5 foot wide, 6, 10 feet if you want. That you can make it as wide as you want. Refresh it every year or two because it's going to break down quickly depending on the type of mulch you use. The only trick is don't pile it too deeply. And I have seen a lot of stuff in Lincoln and Omaha where they come in, the landscaper comes in every year, puts a new layer of mulch down before it all breaks down. And after a few years, the mulch layer is, a foot deep. And so that's just acting like you've raised the soil that many inches. So just be smart about it. Over time, you can probably get away from mulching if it's an individual tree in the landscape, but it's going to be several years before you would want that trunk to stand up against potential lawnmower and trimmer damage. And then don't do this volcano mulching. Stake properly. The guide will tell you, the ISA study guide will tell you to not stake trees if you don't have to. And I agree with that, but I don't think they plant too many trees in Nebraska, or they might have not been too that prominent about it, because I'll tell you what, the trees I plant in Nebraska, if they have a heavy canopy that year, they're going to blow over if they're in the open a little bit. So it depends on each tree. If it's a heavy bald and burlap tree, spade dug tree, you probably don't need to stake it. If it's a lighter container tree, you might need to stake it. So that's just an individual preference, and you maybe just plant it and feel how loose it is in the soil to figure that out. And then when you stake it, you can either use, there's lots of methods, a one stake method, a double stake method, guying wires, or an angle stake. I'm so lazy now in my older age, I use almost always just a single angle stake, but I'm planting smaller trees that I can get away with that more. When I plant bigger trees about this size, I generally use 2 T-posts at 180 degrees apart from each other, north and south, and then I guy back to the tree. And then when you guy back to the tree, use a broad strapping material at the connection to the tree, not wire and hose, that kind of thing. So just be smart about it. But there's more than one way to skin a cat on these things. And I don't know why I said that. Why are we skinning cats all the time? That's stupid. But there's just more than one method to do proper staking. Just make sure the tree can flex and move a little bit in the wind, because you don't want it to snap off. If you haven't staked it, or if you've overstaked it, its root system won't establish very well and it won't get good trunk taper. I got to be moving along here. Protection from mechanical and animal damage is a big thing I deal with in Waverly. Every tree I plant, I put a trunk guard on, because I plant in the parks and the schools where I do not trust the people caring for the trees. I've had a lot of trunk mower damage over the years. So I like to use this mesh, real stiff plastic mesh guard that A.M. Leonard sells. And they come in 4 to 6 foot lengths. And I cut those into foot to 18-inch lengths so that I can protect young trees from rabbit damage, string trimmers, and mowers. This is different than trying to protect it from deer. And we'll talk about deer protection in the next slide. But this is what I like to do. These wraparound plastic things can help for a year or two, but I don't generally use them or leave them on. They photodegrade, break up, and come across and come off and become a trashy thing in the landscape. Here's another type of preformed plastic guard that works well for string trimmer damage. One thing I like about these black plastic mesh type is they are perforated all the way down. So you wrap them around the tree. I use one little zip tie to hold it on. But what I've seen over the years, if you forget about it and you have a small zip tie doing that, it'll pop it. And so it won't cause trunk damage, whereas some of these other things could girdle that trunk over time. Now, ideally, you would take that zip guard off and take this trunk guard off after 4 or 5 years. Here's another type of corrugated plastic material that you could use. That's generally used for transporting trees, but I've left it on a year or two to protect from mechanical damage. Now, speaking of animal damage, those darn deer, man, they're a horrible problem across the state now, especially if you live on the edge of town or in the country. Look at this method here on the lower left. I don't know where this guy got those cages, but geez, you're going to keep an elephant from hurting your tree with those cages. That's pretty cool. People go to all kinds of extent on this. One thing I figured out for me in Waverly on the edge of town where we have deer issues, I need that fence to be about 4 feet tall and about 3 foot to 4 foot at least in circumference if I'm going to get any protection from that deer. Otherwise, they'll reach in there and nibble at that. And of course, the big thing with deer is not eating the trees, although that can be part of it, but they're rubbing their horns on it and causing all kinds of damage. What about trunk wrap? I do not use any trunk wrap, and I don't know of any good purpose to use trunk wrap. Some people like to protect young thin bark trees like maples in the winter with trunk wrap. I don't see any good evidence that that should be done. If you're having frost cracking, that's probably happening more from a damaged trunk than from just thin bark, is my opinion. Now, if somebody else wants to challenge me on that, go ahead. So in summary, start with good nursery stock, plant it at the right depth, make sure you've dug the hole properly, firm foundation to put the tree on. You don't want the bottom of the hole to be loose. Use backfill of the same soil that came out of the hole. So I sometimes put amendments in there if it's really horrible clay, but that's just an effort I make here in Waverly. Put some mulch over the top and then stake it if you need to keep it from blowing over. It's not rocket science, is it? And let me wrap up with just a few other comments here to get us off to a good start. Good design and placement in the landscape is critical, and these are a couple things to keep in mind. When possible, don't scatter trees as individual trees, but try to group them together a little bit so they have a fighting chance with each other and with understory plantings. Separate trees from the turf grass zone to limit potential damage from turf care activities. And then site the trees properly. If we don't put the tree in the right space, we're also shortchanging ourselves in the long term. So think about things like soil moisture, soil quality, sun and shade, site topography. Is it a north-facing slope or south-facing slope? That can make all the difference in the kind of tree you want to plant. And then is the site irrigated? In Waverly, this is what I see happen quite often. People see their trees as individual things in the landscape. These are soldiers that just stick up like a sore thumb in the lawn, and man, they look alone to me and ready for some sort of damage if we're not careful. And then a lot of people like to put these little concrete containers around them to put flowers in or who knows what else. They think it looks better, and maybe that does look better, but we're setting our trees up for issues down the road here when we do that. We've changed the grade here in this tree. These are trees that I planted or I had planted in Waverly by a nursery outfit because I help manage our street tree plantings. We put the trees in, and then the homeowners come and put these concrete blocks down, and then they put soil back in above there. Why did we bother to plant those trees? You know, they just killed them. And so maybe sometimes you can plant flowers around the base of it and it looks pretty good. Or look at this one here. Maybe it started at the right depth and you got away with it. But ideally, you don't do any of that if you don't have to. Just use mulch and let that separation from the lawn happen naturally, in my opinion. Talking about planting trees tight together, learning from Mother Nature. We obviously can't do this for every tree in the landscape. It's okay to have individual trees, but where we can get away with it, plant trees in groups. When we mass trees together, we separate them from turf grass. We have a better maintenance zone for our trees. They help each other establish in the landscape and last longer. We have healthier root zones. I think they're more beautiful when they're kind of tight with other plantings, and then the maintenance is easier. So here's just a few examples of putting our trees tighter together at the time of planting so that they grow better and have better outcomes long term. And then finally, species selection is critical. Right tree, right place. Don't screw this up, or none of the other things we did matter. Here's what many people want when they say, Justin, I want a tree. I want a fast growing tree with nice spring flowers, good fall color. I don't want it to be messy, and it shouldn't drop any fruit, dang it. And it shouldn't grow too tall, and it needs to survive without any care in the lawn that I love. What kind of a tree is going to, we'll give them a plastic tree from Walmart and maybe that will survive it. But it really does matter to think about the kind of tree you're planting. If it's a Buckley oak from the hot, dry plains of Oklahoma and Kansas, you're not going to plant that in a wet spot, are you? That's not the best spot for it. That needs a hot, dry, open, sunny site. Is it a birch tree? Our climate is shifting away from birch trees, so you're going to need afternoon shade and a cool site of some kind with consistent moisture. Is it a bald cypress? You plant that on the top gravelly knob at the driest site, or maybe you put that by the pond edge where it wants to be. What if you're planting along a street? Are you going to plant a walnut that's going to drop tons and tons of nuts, or maybe an elm tree that will canopy over the street? And then finally, if you're planting things like Callery pear, which are invasive species, you've done it wrong.
Hey, Justin, we did have one question from Scott in the chat. This might end up being another one of your famous tree lists that you need to put together. How about species that prefer individual planting? I can think of a couple myself, but how about trees that you really would want to avoid planting in groups?
Yeah, that's a real good, avoid planting in groups.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not thinking any off the top of my head that would prefer to be alone, but certain trees lend themselves better than that other. And for example, a bur oak, it wants to get big and wide and, give it 60 feet of space, although they can be planted tightly together. An American elm comes to mind, a catalpa, hackberry comes to mind, honey locust.
Kurt's saying walnut, but if you're growing walnut for timber, you certainly want to keep those close together so they grow tall and straight. So it kind of depends on the context.
We better let you go, Graham. Do you want me to worry about these questions at the end of the chapter, or maybe let you do your part?
No, let's go through all those. Mariana asked sycamore. Yeah, plant sycamore alone, plant it in groups. Either way, it's going to do really well.
Yeah, that's a really good question, guys. I don't mean to insinuate every tree needs to be planted in groups. They don't. Just be aware that where we can group them, they're going to grow better. Does that make sense to you? Okay, looking at the chapter 7 workbook, we got to get through this quickly. Graham needs to talk about tree protection. So in the workbook, we'll go through this quickly. Trees are generally available from the nursery in one of 4 forms. The answer is balled and burlapped, bare root, container grown, or containerized. Number 2, bare root trees are normally planted when dormant before buds begin to grow. Number 3, girdling roots can become a problem because they can constrict the vascular system in the trunk or in other roots. Number 4, planting holes should be dug to 2 to 3 times the width of the root ball at the surface, with the sides sloping down. I should have said that when we were talking about planting. Number 5, trees that are dug in the nursery are often wrapped with burlap to help keep the root ball intact and reduced exposure of roots to the air. Number 6, the planting hole should never be deeper than the root ball. Number 7, in areas where the soil is heavy clay, plant trees with the root ball 2 to 3 inches higher than the original grade. I get that a lot in Waverly. 8, true or false? Research has shown that soil amendments generally do not assist the tree in establishment and growth. That is true. 9, digging a tree for transplanting can remove as much as 90% of the roots. That is true. In temperate climates, number 10, the best times to transplant trees is in the spring or the fall, early spring or the fall. 11, when transplanting tree or trees, the root ball should be 10 to 12 inches in diameter for every inch of tree caliper. In general, a root ball depth of, what do they say here? 2.5 to 3 feet should be sufficient. Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. I never plant trees 2 feet deep, so I guess I'm doing something a little different. But if that's probably a bald and burlap tree. 12, if trees have wire baskets to help maintain the integrity of the root ball, these baskets should never be removed, nor should the top portion be cut off. That is false. They can be removed and or the cut off in the hole. Most of the new roots generated after planting will grow horizontally and near the soil surface. That is true. 14, pre-digging to create more densely rooted ball is called root pruning. That happens in the nursery industry. And 15, staking of newly planted trees is always necessary. Oh, not always necessary. That is true. Not always necessary. 16, name 3 adverse effects of staking or guying of trees. Any of these 3. Wounding of trunk or branches, girdling if left in place too long, less stable root development, and uneven trunk, wood, and taper development. 17, the material used to attach tree to the stake should be broad, smooth, and flexible. That is true. 18, warm soil temperatures and adequate soil moisture are the optimal conditions for new root growth. In general, palm trees are easy to transplant. True. When transplanting palms, I've never planted a palm, so I don't know why I'm telling you this, but when transplanting palms, the fronds are often tied up to protect the solitary bud. Remember, a palm tree is not like a true tree with a woody core.
You're talking about palms because there's many questions on the ISA.
Yes, right, Chrissy. You better be prepared for your palm questions, and that's fair. Transplant shock is mainly due to water stress from great reduced root system. If fertilizer is applied at planting, it should be blank type to avoid excess salt and building in the root zone. Slow release. Okay. True or false, there is no advantage to pruning 1/3 of the tree crown at the time of planting. True. We no longer prune the canopy of the tree to compensate for the lost root system because we will be cutting away the food production aspects of that tree. Number 24, the most important maintenance factor in the survival of newly planted tree is proper watering. Number 25, true, false, tree roots may suffocate if the tree receives too much water after planting, and that is true. I see more problems with too much watering than not enough in eastern Nebraska. So I think we better leave it there for now, Graham, and let you get after your part of it.
Yeah, that sounds good. We can come back around to the challenge questions if we get some time then.
Yep.
And I will get my screen share going here. So I drew the short straw a little bit, I guess. This isn't the sexiest topic as far as the ISA manual goes, but it does have some important stuff in it. Full disclaimer, I can count on one hand the number of times I've installed support systems, and I can count on 0 hands the number of times I've installed lightning protection. So don't look to me as an expert or someone to turn to for the real in-depth questions. Mainly, we're going to just focus on the content in the book and the general broad strokes of how and why we do this and some of the equipment that's involved. For cable and brace, mostly we're doing this to add support to the tree to minimize the chance of failure in a tree. Now, from an arboricultural perspective, what you're doing when you install cables and braces and threaded rods in a tree is you're putting a sign in the tree that says, as a company or as a property manager, I've identified a defect in the tree and I'm choosing to address it this way instead of through pruning or removal, some other mitigation strategy. So there's always a bit of, I don't want to say liability, but it is making a choice in this direction rather than another in terms of mitigating the chance of something failing in the tree. And so you really have to weigh your odds carefully on when this is appropriate and when it isn't. So split crotches, co-dominant leaders like this ash we see in the top right, lion-tailed trees. We'll talk about that when I cover pruning. When you lion-tail trees and elevate them excessively and take out all the interior growth, you're concentrating the force of winds on narrower parts of the branch. So we're concentrating wind loads up here rather than distributing that wind force throughout the whole canopy. And then, just poor pruning practices sometimes can be mitigated this way as well. So if there's one takeaway from this presentation I'm giving you today, have these manuals on hand, know them, live them. This is everything. If I have one suggestion for a homeowner that wants to be sure that their tree service is doing right by their trees, I tell them, first of all, of course, get somebody certified, and then also ask if they're following all ANSI A300 standards for pruning. And there is an ANSI 300 standard for these supports and cables as well. And so we'll talk about some of the rules of thumb there, but go by this today. If you have a tree service and you don't have this on hand and you're not familiar with the information, this is the industry standard for how these practices should be done. So we'll start with bracing. This is where you're installing a rigid rod through 2 leads in the tree in order to give structural support. As I mentioned earlier, this is often done in conjunction with co-dominant leaders where you have tight branch angles with bark inclusion, weak attachment. You start to see a crack forming and then the phone rings and your homeowner wants to know what to do. Your client is concerned about their tree. They don't want to lose one of those 3 leads. And so sometimes you can elect to go this route instead. This involves metal rods and fasteners. There are cases where sometimes you can put anchor points in the tree that don't exit the other side. That's more in a cabling situation. And these are usually installed at or near the branch union. So for anybody that's can remember high school or college physics and the way leverage works, there's a lot of force acting on the crotch that we see down below here, and it's exacerbated by how long and heavy these leads are. So I'm not very confident in how much strength that this offers trees lots of times. It is going to prevent or reduce the amount of sway that's going on and the tree continuing to crack open further. But it's really kind of a band-aid for a problem that you've already identified and are choosing not to take a more aggressive approach with. With cabling, this is done at greater distances, and I think the physics are much more in your favor with this sort of approach where you're installing this higher in the tree where you're not fighting the leverage of those weight forces right down by the crotch or the branch union. This can be done with either a static metal cable. It's also often called airline or airplane cabling, or synthetic ropes that have more give and stretch, and they're a more dynamic approach. You can see in the diagram on the right side kind of how that typically happens. And one one thing to note down in the bottom here is after you put that threaded rod in, lots of times people will bash the end of this with a hammer to break the continuous threading, so that over time, if the tree canopy is continuing to move in the breeze and sort of wiggle those nuts off over time, they'll hit the end of that rod and they won't come all the way off. But that's, again, really kind of a worst case scenario approach. Hopefully you've noticed that those nuts are not staying on there tight long before that becomes an issue. But most homeowners are not going to want to have a significant amount of threaded rods sticking out of the tree to accommodate the trunk continuing to get thicker over time. You know, it has its own safety hazards having a big piece of metal sticking out of the tree. And there we go. So these dynamic systems are where you're working with multiple leads and trying to keep everything sort of connected to each other in a positive way. Now, as the diagram shows up here, we do not want to be cabling two leads together and then pulling off of that to a third lead and concentrating all that force from one that, in this case, this would be the branch in the tree that's of concern. And there's going to be twist and sway to all three of these leaders. And if we're expecting both of these branches to support the third, it's not going to work as well as you know, a center point or a triangulation really being the key to this being done effectively. For guying or staking, this is where we're taking a tree and we're anchoring it to a point outside of the canopy of the tree, whether it's down to the ground, over to other trees, onto a pole or a tie-in point on a building. All these have their own advantages and disadvantages. With ground anchors, you want to be sure that you're picking something that screws deep enough into the ground that it's sufficiently anchored for the weight and the forces that tree is going to exert on the cable that goes down to it. The concern with other trees, of course, is what's the stability of the tree that you're anchoring the one of concern to. And then, of course, the same is true with a utility pole or an anchor on a building. I saw a funny video on social media recently where a guy had a arborvitae that was right against the house. It had fallen over, probably sitting at about a 30-degree angle from the ground. And he wrapped the come-along around the gutter, the downspout to the gutters, thinking that was going to be strong enough as an anchor point to pull that arborvitae upright. And you know, you can guess and picture the result of all that. Some of the gutter and the siding itself was all ripped off the tree as he started to tighten that come-along. And we'll talk about this rule of thumb here in just a second. So with equipment, of course, it's always worth mentioning you need all your personal protective equipment per usual. We're working with, in this case, cables under tension. And so in the event of a failure, you want to be sure that you have all your really important parts protected along the way to minimize any injury you might have if something happens. Sometimes if you haven't tightened the end of a cable onto its anchor point strong enough, it can come loose from there. Sometimes if you have undersized the cable that you're using, it can snap under those loads as you're tightening everything down. It's good to have a bucket for all your tools. If you're going to be aloft, of course, it's nice to have a single place for all the different parts and hand tools that you're going to need while you're up in the tree. Come along, as I mentioned before, is basically just a temporary cabling device that can allow you to take two branches in the tree and put some tension on them that allows for you to install the cable and then loosen the come along so that you're not working with that cable that you're installing permanently under tension. Gas-powered drill. This is really huge. We'll see another picture of that later. It's a heavy piece of equipment and you're using usually very long drill bits in order to not only get through the branch that you have to start on drilling through, but then have that hole line up with the one that you're going to make on the corresponding branch across the way. So it's important for the strength of the system to have both of the holes that you're drilling through the branches in line with each other. You don't want one hole drilled at this angle and another one drilled at this angle, and then your attachment points inside of there. You want both of those holes that you drill through the branch to be in a straight line with each other in order to maximize the strength of the equipment that you're installing. And then, of course, your climbing gear or your bucket truck, whatever you're using to get up into the tree. So here's an example of kind of what you're working with. And again, this drill bit has to be really long in order to keep that line good. So it's very important, just like Justin was talking about with tree planting, measure twice, drill once, make really sure that you've got a good line before you start in this first branch, and that's going to intersect with the fattest part of the other branch that you're installing into, as opposed to having not so great angle in here, and now you have to back out and start over and leave a second hole that wasn't necessary in the tree. So the biggest question, of course, with your clients or on the properties that you manage is, does this particular tree need a support system? So we've identified a defect in the tree. It's also important to mention that we don't just cable or brace trees willy-nilly just because, as like a preventative issue necessarily. I've never encountered that, at least. We're typically doing this because we're responding to something that's going on in the tree that's of concern. So does a particular tree need a support system or not? Of course, there are the chainsaw warriors that just really enjoy cutting stuff down or cutting branches off, and that's a solution to every problem. That's certainly not always the case. There are times when we can use less invasive practices to keep a tree in good condition. There's also the Captain Save a Tree folks that absolutely fight, any sort of major pruning or removal work, and they want to do everything they can, try everything possible before they resort to that step. And that extreme isn't that great either, because as we're managing trees in urban spaces, there are a lot of risk factors that we have to take into consideration that just aren't at play with the trees in the back 40 on your property, where we don't have streets, city infrastructure, vehicles, roads, or God forbid, people that could be impacted by that failure actually happening in the defect that you've identified. So it's much better to have a balanced approach. There's no decision tree that you could walk through that would get you to the right answer. You as an arborist need to rely on your experience and the experience of others that you trust to make those calls on a case-by-case basis. Generally speaking, though, with older trees, we're dealing with trees that are really big, really heavy, and they're not in a real vigorous state. And so the forces at play are going to be much greater and more likely to be a problem for those systems if you install them in the tree. With really little trees, oftentimes we just probably bought a tree that was poor nursery quality, and it's much easier to take a loss on that tree and replace it. But if we have trees that are they're vigorously growing, they can respond to some pruning in conjunction with a support system, then we have a tree that's a much more likely candidate for this as a sound practice. And again, these are just really broad strokes here. It's still a case-by-case basis. This is sort of the same thinking that we have when we talk to folks about injecting for emerald ash borer. You have a big old tree. It's not going to respond very well once it's infested, and you're just sort of putting lipstick on a pig. With really young ash trees, I wouldn't treat those either, because it's much easier to get it out and put something else in that's not going to have that injection liability. But if you have a tree that's giving a lot of benefits, it's perfectly situated for shading your house and saving energy, or it has some sentimental value, then give some thought to some of these mitigation measures, whether it's a support system or an injection to keep the tree alive. And then finally, the big thing with all this, and this can be an important selling point for you as a tree service owner, if you're going to install one of these systems, then you should be inspecting it regularly. What do I mean by regularly? There's probably people with more experience that have a better answer, but I would say at least annually. And so you either need to price the service on the front end to accommodate the time that it's going to take for you to go inspect that tree, or you charge for the time to inspect those systems annually after the fact. But either way, if you're just bidding the service as a one-time thing, then you're going to be way less inclined to want to go spend time checking on these systems, making sure that you don't have the tree swallowing up the ends of your brace rods, or growing over and around your tie-in points. So just like us, trees are going to need regular checkups if you're going to be installing these sort of things in them. It's not something that you can just walk away from and forget. Okay. Now, lightning protection, as I mentioned, I can talk about concepts. I've never installed any of this before, but I think it's pretty straightforward information on how and why we do this sort of thing and what you use. So when a tree is struck by lightning, it's usually because it's either on the edge of a forest, it's near a water body, it's in the open all by itself, or it's one of the taller trees in a stand of trees that are in a forest situation. So the energy from the lightning is drawn to the moisture and the physical structure being really high in the air. And as the lightning comes down into the tree, it's going to follow the path of least resistance, just like water does. Now, the good thing about this is that for trees, all the moisture is pretty much in the cambium on the outside edge underneath the bark. Of course, this is the living tissue, so it's not good to have living tissue damaged by lightning strikes, but it's really fairly uncommon for the interior trunk of the tree to be just blown open like we see on the right-hand side. And usually when we do see this sort of damage from a lightning strike on a tree, it's because the tree already had extensive decay and probably moisture that was being absorbed into punky wood on the inside of the tree that brought that energy from the lightning strike into the interior of the trunk and just completely compromised the whole structural integrity of the tree. So what's much more common is you have this stripe going down through the cambium to the ground. And what's important there is that in the lightning's path to the ground, it's just using a wet road through the tree to make its way from the sky down into the soil. And so when we're installing lightning protection systems, what we're doing is giving the lightning an even easier path to do that without impacting the tree extensively. So that picture on the right is much more likely to be what you see. And there are cases, maybe 1 out of 5, I think 20% is the number given in the book, but occasionally you'll have lightning strikes that don't manifest any physical symptoms on the outside of the tree, unless you were aloft and seeing a charred entry point high up in the canopy. So some terminology right from the book. Side flash, this is where a tree will be struck by lightning and actually will not continue to the ground. It'll jump over to an adjacent tree or a metal light pole that's near the tree. It'll come some ways down from the top of the tree towards the ground and then move over to the side. And so this is part of why you probably heard, if you're out on the golf course it starts to rain and lightning and thunder, the last thing you want to do is go stand under a big tree. Now it's going to keep you a little drier than being out in the open, but it's going to drastically increase your chance of being part of the party if that lightning strike happens on the tree you're standing under. And side flash is part of how that happens. Another way you can be injured in these sort of instances is by the ground itself being energized. Even if you don't have side flash coming from the tree directly to you, you can have that energy move down into the ground. And especially if your feet are spread apart like we normally stand, there's going to be a differential there that draws that energy through your body from one foot back down through the other leg and back down into the ground. Step voltage is talked about a little bit. I kind of mentioned how if with your feet spread apart, that increases the likelihood of you becoming part of the circuit that voltage is moving through. With utility line, when some problem happens, you impact a utility line, you drop a branch on a line, that branch is also touching the bucket truck or something like that. They tell you to get out of the area that you need to by making short hops with both feet at the same time. And that speaks to the same sort of step voltage as well, where if one foot is further away from the energized point than the other, then that's going to create a differential that makes the energy want to move through your body. The lightning protection system has 3 parts. We're going to put an air terminal up in the top of the tree as high up as we're able to. If you have a tree with a really spreading canopy, often there are multiple air terminals. These are the points that are going to attract the lightning to it and then direct it through the conductor down to the ground. And so the 3 parts that you need to know about are the air terminals that are installed high up in the tree, the copper lines that are attached to those terminals and sort of anchored onto the trunk of the tree on its way down to the ground, creating that pathway. And then you're going to take that conductor down into the ground, probably about 8 inches or so below the ground, and bring that away from the tree. So you're not going to terminate this ground rod right at the base of the tree. You're going to bring that ground rod out away from the tree as well, so that the root system of the tree doesn't get impacted by that energy going back into the ground right by the base of the tree. Also a note here in this diagram, oh yeah, that's kind of what I mentioned. Get that ground away from the tree, preferably out to the drip line or so, and that's going to minimize the chance of a significant amount of the tree's root system being damaged by the lightning. And same goes for this, like the support systems. You need to inspect these lightning protection, probably not as frequently because we're not so much concerned about whether the conductors are going to snap or anything like that. What we're concerned with is whether the tree is kind of swallowed up and grown over the conductor, and now the tree has sort of integrated the conductor into the trunk instead of having that be a separate pathway from the tree itself. And then of course, sometimes these staples or double-headed nails that you install that conductor onto the trunk with can wiggle loose over time. And so you just want to be sure that everything's securely attached to the tree throughout the time that you're using it, as well as not being enveloped by the tree itself. Mariana, I once visited a homeowner whose tree was suddenly charred all around, figured out it was hit by lightning. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you will see bark blown away from the tree, 20, 30 feet away, depending on how big of a tree we're talking about, how strong of a lightning strike. You can have pretty significant, obvious indicators, but as I mentioned, sometimes lightning strikes can have very little obvious symptoms from outside the tree unless you're up and able to see right where the lightning probably struck. So there's only about 2-3 pages on all this in the book. I don't think you're going to encounter a lot of questions about it, but we will go through the workbook questions here. how about we do this? Time-wise, I think we're doing pretty good. Oh, we got to wrap up here pretty quick. So 3 instances where cabling might be called for. You've got a defect, a weak crotch is what's mentioned in the answer key. Multi-stemmed trees that are codominant or a really weak wooded tree. Common grade cable is relatively malleable and easy to work with. Extra strength cable is much stronger but less flexible than common grade. One advantage of aircraft cable is that it's both strong and flexible. Potential drawback is limitation of choices for attachment in the tree. I had a diagram on an earlier slide kind of showing how that works, but not real familiar with the process of installing those attachment points for airline cable. As a general rule, cable should be installed 2/3 of the distance from the weak branch union to the top of the tree. Now that doesn't mean 2/3 of the way up from the ground, but from the defect that you've identified to the top of the tree, you want to go 2/3 of that distance up to install your cables. Limbs may be brought closer together while installing the cable so that when released, the cable will be just taut. Oh, sorry. Dead end hardware such as eye bolts, threaded rods, aim and eye nuts can be used as anchors in smaller branches that are not decayed. Dead end hardware just meaning it doesn't stick out the other side of the branch and have a nut on it. You're just screwing that into the branch to some depth that's going to be sufficient. In decayed wood or limbs greater than 8 inches in diameter, eye bolts, threaded rod. Oh yeah, so these are the 3 types of hardware that you're going to want to use to attach cables to. Got something else in the chat. If you see bark brown out on only one side of the tree from branch tip to root collar, it's likely a lightning strike. Thank you, Chrissy. Sometimes you can just have kind of a dead spot that's not sloughing bark right away. 8, true or false, when more than one cable is installed on the same limb, the hardware should be spaced at least as far apart as the diameter of the limb. That is true. You don't want too many anchor points all in one spot, or you start to compromise the strength and the integrity of that branch right where you are drilling those holes. A thimble is what's used to form the eye at the end of a cable. EHS cable should be attached to hardware using dead end grips. True or false? The installation of metal cables, if done properly, will not wound the tree. That is false. Of course, the second that drill bit sinks into the branch, we are in fact wounding the tree. The 2 types of rods commonly used to brace a tree are machine threaded rods and lag threaded rods. Number 13, when bracing a tree with a machine threaded rod, the pre-drilled hole should be approximately 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch larger than the diameter of the rod. You do not want to use a drill bit that's bigger than the threaded rod you're installing in the tree, because we want the thread from the rod actually biting into the wood. 14, dynamic support systems allow for more tree sway and acting restraint only when environmental conditions demand it. So that triangular setup that we saw allows each of those leads to still kind of move with the breeze, but not so much that they cause that failure that we're concerned with. 15, guying is the installation of a cable between a tree and an external anchor point to provide support and reduce tree movement. So guying is when the support extends beyond the canopy of the tree to attach somewhere else. 16, rigid structures mounted or built on the ground to support a branch or trunk are called props. There we go. 17, a phenomenon in which lightning travels down the stem. We talked about this a bit. This is the side flash, where it moves through the tree and then jumps to another area to continue that path of least resistance. 18, lightning protection system cable is made from copper, again for its electricity conducting properties. 19, if a tree has a crown radius smaller than 35 feet, Only one conductor is required. Circumstances where lightning protection for trees might be recommended. The book lists historic trees, trees that are high value, or trees that are prone to strikes within golf courses. Anytime you have a big tree that's likely to get struck by lightning in an area that has high human traffic, that's a good time to use that sort of thing. So buzz through those pretty quick. Any questions here? I know we're a little bit over time, so I want to respect everybody's schedules. You guys feel okay about all that?
I thought it was fabulous.
Good deal. Awesome. I see some thumbs
Unbiased.
up. So we will adjourn for the day then. I guess I didn't get a chance to ask for the CEU codes, so go ahead and get that going now. We'll leave the Zoom room open for you to get that information to us, either in the group chat or privately to Chrissy or I. Get us your NAA and ISA certification numbers so we can get your units to assigned to you. All right.
Yep, thank you, everybody. I will try and have that resource page link out to everybody by the end of today, okay?
So if you miss any sessions, there will be recordings that you can review, and those will be live until the end of March for you. Thanks, everyone.